Hi, and welcome to another segment on philosophy. This one's on Schopenhauer, or Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived in the 19th century, and he studied Kant. He studied the Greek philosophers, and he also was influenced by his contemporaries, although he wasn't a big fan of Hegel and Fichte. Um, so he wrote this book called the World as Will and Representation, and it's kind of fantastic because it sort of connects into the modern conception of the Matrix in the movie, the philosophy of the Matrix, twofold. First, there is the representation, which Schopenhauer believes is created by a mind looking, and for the first time with his first eye, so to speak, looks around and this eye sort of like perceives the whole world for every other mind, and it's all connected to this subject, and this subject, this human being, or this representative being, kind of creates the world. And that's I think I would argue that it's connected to the Buddhist notion of the mind creates the world. And there's this idea that we create a mental picture or a mental image. That's very important in this representation of the world, because it's the time, it's a period of time and a space and a causality where all these are known, all these data are known, but for the subject and object come together in sort of a harmony, a reciprocal harmony, and they create this. That's where the will, and that's where the representation comes in. So both of those happen at the same time. Another thing that's happening is that the subject and the object are limiting one another. When the subject comes into play, like for example a tree, a human being looking at a tree, and the tree is the object. Well, once the human being stops looking at the tree, or maybe the tree is removed or dug out, then there's a reciprocal arrangement so that only the subject's fully there. And essentially underlying a lot of this, I'm going to give you like some terms now that kind of help you understand this will and representation even further. Basically, Schopenhauer came up with this idea of a fourfold root of principle of sufficient reason, which is basically just a way of saying that every reason has an effect. Everything we do is sort of imprisoned by this logical step, logical connections, and either in material things, abstract concepts, mathematical, or psychologically motivating forces. All of these are dependent and cannot intermix with all the different reasoning powers we have: the cause and effect reasoning, logical reasoning, reasoning in reference to numbers, intentions or moral reasoning. All of these are dependent, they're interlinked with the material things, the abstract, the mathematical, the psychological forces. And from this, Schopenhauer's investigation of the principle of sufficient reason can be characterized as an inquiry into the nature of the various kinds of necessary connections. So he's really concerned with connections, and he's interested in how this will play out, particularly because the will itself is not from it doesn't is a modification. The will is a modification of knowledge, and because of that, it doesn't it doesn't proceed as it does not proceed, and it doesn't have. Um, it's basically like the kernel of our nature, and it's very mysterious, but it carries out both of its tasks, or sorry, it carries its tasks out in both the unconscious and the conscious functions. So let's go back to the principle of sufficient reason, because that plays a part, because it sort of grounds everything, and it's sort of the it's what everything here, what I mean everything, I mean like every object must adhere to this, and the law of causality is used out of Kant's 12 categories of mind. He chooses the law of causality as the only applicable and only really important mental faculty. And so causality is determined. It's a priori, which a priori is just something that comes dependently of the cognitive functions or cognitive faculties, and its knowledge that precedes mental reasoning comes out of deductive reasoning. So it comes proceeding from something that's already, it comes proceeding from an object already existing. Whereas post priori comes out of something, an observation out of something that is not already existing, has to be created, because it's through observation that post priori knowledge occurs. So just that's another definition that's important for really understanding in depth this will and representation. So we've kind of gotten the sufficient reasoning done. It's like a general framework or logical, consistent logical entrapment of how things just come about in the world, because the cause is always preceded by, or sorry, it's always followed by an effect, and every effect needs a cause. So that's essentially the law of causality, but it's embedded in the principle of sufficient reasoning, and this gives rise to representation. This interplay between the law of, or the principle of sufficient reasoning, and the law of causality. And let's go back to the subject and the object, for example. They're actually, they form a reciprocal relationship, as I already mentioned, but they've got like this matrix-like. Okay, when I say matrix, I mean the movie, The Matrix, the philosophy behind the movie. Because even without knowledge of time and space and causality, because they're figured out, they're figured out a priori. The object doesn't know of this. That means that data for anything in the world is already known, just like in Google Maps. So for Schopenhauer, we already are living in the matrix, because the world is all these representations where they already exist because of space, time, and causality. So those data are available. We're just trying to figure out what exactly is this the object. What is this thing doing here? And so another sort of matrix idea is that the first eye. I think I mentioned that already. The first eye is that when someone sort of like came up with a mental image and they projected it onto with their mind, or maybe it's the mind itself doing it. Maybe we live inside the mind. But I think Schopenhauer really said that it's almost like somebody projecting onto, or not projecting, but creating a mental image, and then this mental image somehow gets sent to all of the world, and as a representation of the world. And then the equivalent of, it's like the equivalent of like a projector being switched on. So instead of humans being plugged in their energy machines, like in the Matrix, what happens in the Matrix when they're all plugged in for harvesting, for being harvested, it's like the machines themselves have plugged themselves in to being harvested, or they have to endure this switching on, and they relay the representation to everyone else's mind, and this allows for the subject and the object in perception. And so you can see really why that Schopenhauer should be considered a philosopher of perception. He's really created this inside and out way of looking at the world, and that's really impressive because it's just so clear and so well written, this work, that you should really give Volume 1 and Volume 3 a try. Okay, I think I've covered everything up to the will, which is the main part, which is Volume 3's main theses. Basically, the will. I'm just going to read you from what I've copied from the Volume 3. Is that the human observer, or the human subject, is distracted by the details of life and individual distinctions that obscure this will. Only by penetrating the principium individualitas, which is enslaved by the cause and effect tyranny of the principle of sufficient reasoning, as we explained earlier, can the observer perceive the essential thing in itself. And so the thing in itself is the will to live, in one sense, but it also can be in as a image of the world, or a phenomenal, and that's also the will. So the will has essentially both sides of the coin in its manifestation. And so the will, as I said, it actually gets modified. It's modified knowledge, and it's conditioned by the brain, and it's derived from the brain, but it's also the kernel of our nature, and it's the original force which forms and sustains the animal body. So it's like, I think you have to read all that about the scientific evidence, the scientific inspiration for describing the will. But Schopenhauer actually says that we should deny the will, and we should become ascetics to this will, because it's basically just run off desire, and if we suppress our desires enough, then we'll be able to get less will. There'll be less will in our relationships and in our world, and the world won't have a place to act because of the animal body reference there. So, in consequence of this knowledge, we must call something like this, which manifests in our brains and plays out in our bodies, as the will. It is the insight that which acts and strives in nature and exhibits itself in ever more perfect phenomena. When it has worked itself up so far that the light of knowledge falls directly upon it, when it is tamed to the state of self-consciousness, it exists as that will. It is accordingly the thing in itself so far that we can ever be reached by knowledge. So, in a way, the will is actually the only real part of the entire system here of world and representation, because it's that interplay between subject and object, but it's also disjointed from knowledge. So it comes and it goes as it pleases, and we don't have any control over it, really. The only control we have over is if we stop creating it through stopping our desire. So I think it's a valid question to ask: is the will the real? Is it sort of like an entry point into the real? And I'm not sure. I haven't read all that much on the will, so I can't say that it's if that's good. But I mean, definitely, maybe in a future video, I'll talk about, is the will I'll even write it down right now. Okay, if the will is real, it's the only component. What does it manifest as? And kind of like questions to do with the real. Okay, so it was interesting talking about that. Thank you for listening.